because Hanukkah is coming up, I figured we would do a run of Hanukkah related things, just like we did a run of Passover related things before Passover, just like we did a run of high holidays related things just before the high holidays. I understand that Hanukkah is supposed to be a minor holiday, but that doesn't seem to really be true anymore. So lean into it a little bit. And so today I've just called it "What is Hanukkah?" and you'll see why I've used that in quotes, because we could just use it without quotes. You'll see why I'm using it in quotes in a little bit. But what is Hanukkah? And the goal is really become familiar with Hanukkah, how the practices that we have around Hanukkah really developed, and specifically how exactly it is we got to the point that we light a menorah in the way that we do, which is its own, historical journey through Jewish texts. And then to become familiar with the traditional history, and I put that in quotes, history of Hanukkah, because the rabbi's version of history is the rabbi's version of history, and it gets carried forward in some ways and not in others, or it gets tempered in some ways. So it's useful to kind of know what that story is before you move on to the next couple of weeks, where we'll look at the closest thing we have to actual historical sources to figure out what happened and how those things are interpreted. So during this, I will be using these five sources. And just up front, it's helpful to know when they're from and where they're from. So we'll be using the biblical book of Daniel, which dates to 164, 165 BCE, and was almost certainly written somewhere in Judea. We'll use the Babylonian Talmud. There is a Palestinian Talmud. It's not, when people say the Talmud, they're not talking about the Palestinian Talmud, or the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. They're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. That's the one that we'll be looking at. Its analysis of things is more organized almost all the time. And that's how it became the Talmud. And it's compiled over the course of several centuries in a number of cities in Iraq. We don't really know who the people were who compiled it. We don't really know who wrote the section of Daniel we'll be dealing with either. We can be fairly sure that Daniel didn't write any of this book, but we don't know who did, really. But for a biblical book, we can date some of it surprisingly specifically. The Mishnah Torah by Maimonides, which he finished around 1180 CE in Cairo, Egypt. That's important because he's going to make some claims about what people do that aren't limited to where he lived. The Shulchan Aruch, which we can date to 1563 more or less in Tzfat, which is Safed. You've heard it maybe both ways. Tzfat is in the northern reaches of what is currently the state of Israel. It was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. And there are glosses on the Shulchan Aruch that we'll talk about as well. And then Mishnah Berurah, which is from 1884 in Poland, written by Yisrael Meir Kagan, who's called the Chofetz Chaim. So Mishnah Berurah is Shulchan Aruch plus Mishnah Berurah are really the most important legal texts currently used in modern Orthodox Judaism and definitely in ultra-Orthodox Judaism. The vicissitudes of who survived the Holocaust, which rabbis survived the Holocaust, made Mishnah Berurah the thing that people use. So we do have to kind of navigate our way through it a little bit. And so we've got some stuff from Mishnah Berurah. This is Texts on Tuesday. I've actually got texts this time in some fairly lengthy stretches. I've translated it all into English. You don't have to worry about that part. So talking about the origins of Hanukkah, the historical events behind Hanukkah occurred from around 167 to 163 BCE. Um, we're relying on, it's not like everybody used the current calendar, so the years are always a little bit approximate. But we can calculate based on who they said certain rulers were and how they line up in other historical sources from Rome and Greece and whatever else, and we kind of know when these things happen. There is one biblical source for Hanukkah. So almost every major Jewish holiday has a foot in the text of the Tanakh, in the Bible. The one that arguably doesn't, the one major holiday that arguably doesn't, is Hanukkah. But that's only if you refuse to read the book of Daniel in a historical way. And we'll see just how you should be reading some of the book of Daniel. The literature of the rabbis doesn't really talk about what Hanukkah is about until the Talmud. There are other mentions of Hanukkah throughout rabbinic literature, but the rabbis don't come out and say, oh, these are the events, until 500 CE. So you can see there's this gap of really a good 660 years between when the events of Hanukkah occurred and when the rabbis actually kind of put their version of the story out into the world in a way that we can track. The rest of the time, they assume you know what happened on Hanukkah and they don't tell the story. And yet the rabbis don't show awareness of those events, and they don't connect the events up with Hanukkah themselves until pretty late in the game. All of which is to say, we're going to jump a number of years between point A and point B. And in that period of time, the rabbis are not going to take for granted some of the history and some of the biblical roots of this holiday. So we have one source in the Tanakh for Hanukkah, and it's the book of Daniel. It is not, it's part of the Tanakh, it's canonical in the Tanakh. More traditionally minded Jews will not take kindly to them if you walk up and say, Hanukkah is in the book of Daniel, because that's not what they think is happening in the book of Daniel. So we should talk about what's happening in the book of Daniel, why we're able to date it when we are, and why Hanukkah has snuck its way into the Bible, even though mostly it doesn't look like it did. So the main biblical source for Hanukkah is really the whole second half of the book of Daniel. So Daniel is 12 chapters long. Chapters 1 through 6 are stories surrounding a figure named Daniel who is said to have lived in Babylon during the Babylonian exile. And it's largely, not entirely, but largely in Aramaic. So this is where you get the story of Daniel in the lion's den. This is where you get the story of the three men in the furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are really Daniel and two other guys who get thrown into a fiery furnace. And in both of these stories, Daniel is rescued by an angel that later Jewish thought will say is the angel Gabriel. Later Christian thought will say it's not an angel, it's Jesus, just so you know what happens. Chapters 7 through 12 are the earliest known pieces of apocalyptic literature that we have. So apocalyptic literature, cosmic dualism, there are good people and bad people, and there's no in between. Revelation of secret knowledge, teleological view, which is a fancy way of saying we're looking for the end of the world and we're looking for it soon. And there will be reward and punishment for good people and bad people, so decide which side you're on now. So the second half of the book of Daniel is apocalyptic literature, fits all the categories for apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation in the New Testament, like a number of other sources that don't make it into anybody's canon. Revelation is very heavily uses the book of Daniel's imagery to tell its own story. So it's this second half of Daniel that really is related to Hanukkah. The first half of Daniel is really not. So this is from Daniel chapter 8. And this is typical of what you see in apocalyptic literature. Very, very veiled messages. It is not going to come out and say, I'm talking about King XYZ. Instead, you get this. As I looked on, a he-goat came from the west. Then the he-goat grew very great, but at the peak of his power, his big horn was broken. In its place, 4 conspicuous horns sprouted toward the 4 winds of heaven. From one of them emerged a small horn which extended itself greatly toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven, and it hurled some stars of the heavenly host to the ground and trampled them. It vaunted itself against the very chief of the host. On its account, the regular offering was suspended, and his holy place was abandoned. The capital H, I'm using the Jewish Publication Society translation. I just copied and pasted. An army was arrayed iniquitously against the regular offering. It hurled truth to the ground and prospered in what it did. Then I heard a holy being speaking, and another holy being said to whoever it was who was speaking, how long will what was seen in the vision last? The regular offering be forsaken because of the transgression, the sanctuary be surrendered, and the host trampled? He answered me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. While I, Daniel, was seeing the vision and trying to understand it, there appeared before me one who looked like a man. I heard a human voice from the middle of Ulai calling out, Gabriel, make that man understand the vision. Angel Gabriel. He came near to me where I was standing, and as he came, I was terrified and fell prostrate. He said to me, understand, O man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. The apocalypse. That's why it's called apocalyptic literature. So this is wild stuff, right? If you're just reading along and somebody hands you a thing and there's a dream about a he-goat who his horn is broken and 4 horns replace it, and then 1 small horn grows out of it, like, you are legitimately allowed to go, well, that's kind of crazy, right? I mean, but it's all veiled imagery. So we should talk about what some of this stuff means, and then you can unpack it and see why it's related to Hanukkah. Once you know kind of the other history behind Hanukkah, I guess. So the he-goat from the west is Alexander the Great. The 4 horns from the he-goat's head are Seleucus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Cassander. These are his 4 major generals. And not major generals like the rank, his 4 main generals. I feel like we should say main. His 4 main generals, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and Cassander. Antigonus and Cassander, we don't ever really worried about. One of them is farther west, one of them is north. One of them's farther east, and one of them is north. Seleucus and Ptolemy are the ones that we're interested in for Jewish history. The one small horn is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the bad guy from Hanukkah, right? So he is a descendant of Seleucus. So we had 1 horn on the he-goat from the west, that's Alexander. The 4 horns are these 4 families. The small horn that grows from the other small horn is Antiochus, the bad guy from Hanukkah. The beautiful land is the land of Israel. Right? It doesn't say Israel, but Daniel's Jewish, and what's he going to say is the beautiful land? 2,300 evenings and mornings is about 1,150 days, about 3.15 years. So this is the book of Daniel giving a guess as to how long Antiochus's persecution will last. It turns out to be not inaccurate, actually, but accidentally so. So Roberto asks in the chat, do we know who wrote this? Nope. We don't know who wrote it. And this chunk is connected to Daniel 1 through 6, which is written in a different style. And so these don't seem to match up. It's like a bunch of stuff was associated with Daniel, so they slapped it all together. And so we get stuff that's supposed to have happened during the Babylonian exile, and then the end revealed to Daniel supposedly in the second half of the book. So if we take Alexander the Great, if we take all of these and we go back and look at what we just looked at, Alexander the Great comes from the West. We know that happened. He grew great, right? He went all the way to India. At the peak of his power, his bighorn was broken. He died. We know this. Alexander died young. His 4 conspicuous horns, his 4 generals took over north, south, east, and west. From one of them emerged a small horn, Antiochus. And we know Antiochus, which the book of Daniel will call the king of the north. We'll get to that description a little later. We know that Antiochus invaded to his east and invaded to his south. We know he invaded Egypt. He tried to do it a second time and it didn't happen. So we know that he went south. We know he went east, and you can't get to Egypt from Syria where he lived unless you go through Israel. So we know what the beautiful land is. It vaunted itself against the chief of the host, and the regular offering was suspended. We know that the sacrifices stopped in the temple. So that's what he's talking about. Antiochus persecuted. There were no more offerings in the temple. An army was arrayed around it. It did what it wanted. How long? And now we're getting the question, how long does this persecution last? And an answer is given. 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. That's our answer. So about less than 3.25 years. That's the guess. And this was believed to be like the end of the world. There's a temple. It's been occupied again. We're being persecuted. This is terrible. Maybe this is the end of the world. This is the origin of end of the world literature in Jewish thought, is the book of Daniel. So that's the book of Daniel has the basic outline of the Hanukkah story in it. Antiochus comes from the north, displaces the temple sacrifices. There's persecution. We're looking forward to it ending, right? This is the beginning of the story behind Hanukkah. Okay, so that was Daniel 8. The second half of Daniel 7 through 12 is composed of a number of different kind of discrete apocalyptic visions that are all a little bit redundant. So this is Daniel 11, chunks of Daniel 11. There's a lot of skipping that happens here because Daniel 11 verses 15 through 45 is pretty long. The king of the north, this is Antiochus. Well, this is not Antiochus yet. The king of the north is, we will find out, Antiochus's brother. His place will be taken by one who will dispatch an officer to exact tribute for royal glory, but he will be broken in a few days, not by wrath or by war. His place will be taken by a contemptible man on whom royal majesty was not conferred. He will come in unawares and seize the kingdom through trickery. The forces of the flood will be overwhelmed by him and will be broken, and so too the covenant leader. And from the time an alliance is made with him, he will practice deceit, and he will rise to power with a small band. He will muster his strength and courage against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south will wage war with a great and powerful army, but will not stand fast. The minds of both kings will be bent on evil. They'll lie to each other. But it doesn't matter because we know when the end of the world is coming. That is there is yet an appointed term. He will return to his land with great wealth. We're now talking about the king in the north. No, king of the north. King in the north is Game of Thrones. He will return to his land with great wealth, mind set against the Holy Covenant, return to his land at the appointed time. We know when this is supposed to happen because we're getting apocalyptic signs. He will again invade the south, but the second time will not be like the first. Ships from Kittim will come against him. He will be checked and will turn back, raging against the Holy Covenant. Having done his pleasure, he will then attend to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces will be levied by him. They will desecrate the temple, the fortress. They will abolish the regular offering and set up the appalling abomination. He will flatter with smooth words those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people devoted to their God will stand firm. Okay, so we're going to have people rebel against, I'm telling you, this is Antiochus. So again, we have the Hanukkah story happening. At the time of the end, the king of the south will lock horns with him, but the king of the north will attack him with chariots and riders and many ships. He will invade lands, sweeping through them like a flood. He will invade the beautiful land too, and many will fall, but these will escape his clutches: Edom, Moab, and the chief part of the Ammonites. He will lay his hands on lands, not even the land of Egypt will escape. He will gain control over the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Cushites will follow at heel. But reports from east and north will alarm him. He will march forth in a great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal pavilion between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, and he will meet his doom with no one to help him. Wow, this is a lot. So let's define our terms and then go back and look at this again. His place will be taken by a contemptible man, that whole thing. So Seleucus IV is Antiochus's older brother, was assassinated by a usurper, Heliodorus. Antiochus gets rid of Heliodorus. So this is how Antiochus becomes king. He deposes somebody who deposed somebody else. This is the small number of advisors and not being selected for, right? We have that language in there. The king of the south is the Ptolemaic king of the time. So the Ptolemies, for those who don't know this, that line, the Ptolemaic line, ends during the Roman period with Cleopatra. So Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. So an ancestor of Cleopatra is who we're talking about with King of the South. Kittim is Rome. So we know from other sources that when Antiochus decided to try to invade Ptolemy a second time, the Romans came in. They sent a ship with a really old ambassador on it. But whatever the ambassador said was scary enough that Antiochus gave up on his second invasion in the south. And instead, he went back into the land of Israel and plundered there. That's what we're kind of getting here. Those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Antiochus sold the high priest position in Jerusalem to the highest bidder. And basically it went like this: hey, I can get you more tax money. Oh, I need more tax money for all of my wars. Sure, that sounds great. You're the high priest. And then somebody else came around and said, I can get you more money. Oh, you can get me more money. Great. You be the high priest. So the Kohen Gadol, the priest in the temple, the big priest who was responsible for Yom Kippur and all of that stuff, that job was up for grabs with Antiochus, and whoever offered the most money, he gave the job. And the way that they got the most money was they sold stuff that the temple had in the treasury. That's where the money came from. At the time of the end, help him. These are forecasting future events that never occurred, which allows us to date the book of Daniel here, because we know we have all of this happening. The ambassador from Rome will say, hey, you're not going to invade the south again. Get out of here. He will then attend to those who forsook the Holy Covenant. Forces will be levied, desecrate the temple, abolish the regular offering, and set up the appalling abomination. He's going to do in the temple in Jerusalem for a while. And then none of this stuff happened again. So these last 5 verses never occur. Antiochus never goes south again. Antiochus, in fact, dies during the Maccabean revolt. We know what happens to Antiochus. Antiochus dies, and he never invaded south again. So we know, since this never happened, and we know Antiochus died, that this was written between the start of the Maccabean revolt, but before the temple was retaken and the Maccabees won. So we can date this within 3 or 4 years. You kind of go, well, it's either 166, 165, or 164. That's it. It's easy to do because we know exactly where the predictions go wrong. If you get a typical non-evangelical and non-Orthodox Jewish study Bible, it will actually tell you this in the annotations. So the Jewish study Bible that a lot of people have is a Jewish Publication Society, and there's annotations around the edges. They actually tell you, oh, no, this is 166 BCE. We know when this is. And here's where you look in the books of Maccabees, which aren't in the Tanakh. Like they know, they'll tell you where to go to find the historical events that shape all of this. So we have the book of Daniel telling us the Hanukkah story. If you know that it's telling you the Hanukkah story. And it, kind of telegraphs it so that people who were alive at the time who were reading this would know what was being talked about, because they would know about Alexander. They would know about the 4 kings that succeeded Alexander. They would know who Antiochus was. They would know that Rome intervened here. This is not the first time Rome is going to play into the story of the Maccabean family, by the way. We just won't be talking about Rome's second appearance. But if you watch the HBO miniseries Rome, you know when Rome's second appearance was, because it was in the first season of the show. So we've got this book that we know when its apocalyptic visions were. Hanukkah is in the Bible. But an Orthodox Jew is not going to agree that Hanukkah is in the Bible, because this is supposed to be an apocalyptic vision by Daniel that should be right, and therefore it can't be the Maccabean revolt. It has to mean something else. And over the course of 2,000 years, Jews will interpret the apocalyptic stuff in here in lots of different ways. They will usually say that Rome is the bad guy or some variation of Rome. Rome is not a bad guy in the book of Daniel. Rome's a good guy, sort of, I guess. Rome is opposed to Antiochus. So we actually have a lot of the Hanukkah story here, if you know how to look. If you don't know how to look, you have a really, really wild-looking bunch of stories about some guy having visions that involve goats and kings in the north and kings in the south, kings of the north and kings of the south. I got to stop saying king in the north, but I watched so much Game of Thrones that that name is now stuck in my head. So we know the story, and we know that it's in the Tanakh. We just don't recognize it easily because it never says Maccabees and it never says Hasmoneans. It doesn't use the names we expect to see associated with the Hanukkah story. But it's there. I've actually shown you the 2 main passages from the book of Daniel that talk about these events and allow us to date a big chunk of the book of Daniel more precisely than any other biblical book. Actually, more precisely than almost any document from the ancient world, because we know when it happened. We know when it's wrong, so we know when it was written. It's pretty good, actually, as opposed to like the book of Proverbs, which got put together over time, or we don't really know when we know when this came from. So before we move on from Daniel, are there questions? To answer a question nobody has asked, yes, this is taught in first semester Old Testament or Hebrew Bible at colleges and universities. In fact, my professor was going senile and he taught it 2 days in a row. So, Toby, if you're going to talk, you're muted.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
Why did Antiochus, whatever, sell the rights to his priesthood position?
Oh, so Antiochus is willing to decide that he can appoint who the high priest is in the temple in Jerusalem. And basically, the high priest in the temple is the main point of contact between Judea and the empire. So he wants a flunky in that position, because that person's responsible for collecting taxes and all that other stuff. So if you're hiring a tax collector who's also going to be the priest, and the tax collector says, I'm going to get you more money, here's how much money I'm promising you, and you're waging a bunch of wars, which Antiochus always was waging wars, you need a bunch of money, you're willing to kick the old guy out if the new one, and guy, it's always a guy, you're willing to kick the old guy out and put the new one in if the new one says, I'm going to give you an extra 1,000 talents of silver.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
at a certain point, you're talking about a lot of money. And you're busy fighting wars. So that's...
Okay. Makes sense.
And it should be said that these changes in who was the priest were not uncontroversial among the Jews who live there. They just don't have any control over it. It's not a democracy. The high priest is, they know that the priest has to come from the priestly family. They don't really have input on who becomes the high priest. They're just stuck with it. And
thank you.
And there aren't people standing outside of a convention center banging on the windows and telling them to stop the count, that to take something from the current headlines. Other questions?
Thank you.
Okay. I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that a lot of the Hanukkah story is right there, but we haven't heard any of the, unless I've missed it, the traditional elements of except for Antiochus, I guess.
Right. So the traditional elements are coming. The traditional elements that we connect with the Hanukkah story, the Maccabees and the oil and all, they haven't actually happened yet when this book was written. That's part of the knowing that it's wrong and being able to date it is everything after defiling the temple is incorrect.
Okay.
So we don't know. It's not in the book yet.
Right, but the defiling the temple sets up, yeah.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question. Why aren't we going over the books of the Maccabees?
Because we're going to do the books of the Maccabees next week.
Oh.
That's why. I'm doing it in not exactly chronological order. Basically, this is a look at the texts that are generally considered Jewish canon. The books of the Maccabees aren't. But next week is the Maccabees and the Scroll of Antiochus and stuff like that. All these non-canonical works that people still used. And if we're really interested in pain, I guess we could do Josephus too. I still have the Jewish War and all of that stuff hanging around on my shelf. I will not be reading it in Greek. Greek is the reason I don't have a PhD in religious studies. I was not a good Greek student. So what's Hanukkah, right? We have got we see from the book of Daniel that there is a chunk of this history preserved in the Tanakh. Not enough to like build a holiday off of, but it's there. So the rabbis will actually ask this question: what is Hanukkah? They will get around to actually asking the question. They ask these questions faux innocently. So the first literature of the rabbis we have is really from the year 200 CE. So we're already 360 odd years distant from the Hanukkah story before we get any rabbinic literature at all. And the Mishnah from 200 CE is not really a law book exactly. It's more like a compilation of arguments that are relatively easily memorized about particular issues. And they talk about Hanukkah. They never say what Hanukkah is. So they talk about Hanukkah when they're talking about when messengers would be sent out from the land of Israel to kind of synchronize everybody's calendars. And they say one of those times of years is Hanukkah because of the holiday, and we need to make sure that people are celebrating the holidays at the right time. So that's in Tractate Rosh Hashanah 1:3. There's a discussion of Hanukkah menorahs, sort of, in this tractate, Bava Kama. So Bava Kama is one of the books that deals with damages and lawsuits, torts and things like that. And it talks about possible sources of fire and who's liable to pay when there's an accidental fire. And in the context of that discussion, it says, oh, but what happens if a shopkeeper has a Hanukkah menorah outside his door and it causes a fire? They thought about that stuff because now they're doing tort law and they're trying to figure out what happens if there's a fire because you're a blacksmith and an ember goes flying, or you own a camel and a camel lights on fire. I mean, really, these are the things that they think about. They don't say the camel lights on fire. It's carrying flax and the flax lights on fire. But, you know, we still have to figure out who pays. Communal fasts aren't declared on Hanukkah or certain other holidays that don't follow Shabbat rules. Okay, so we've got, there are a number of other mentions, but this is an example of how they talk about Hanukkah. They assume you know what the Hanukkah story is. They're just preserving arguments, and Hanukkah is pulled into these arguments somehow. Pulled into the arguments because they're talking about when messengers go out for the calendar, or because what happens if somebody knocks over your menorah outside your shop, or are there days where you can't fast? Hanukkah is one of the days that you don't fast. But the Talmud, which interprets this book, but, you know, in 500, 600, 700 BCE, 500, 600 CE, actually does tell a version of the Hanukkah story. And it's the first piece of rabbinic literature that really tells the story in one place and says this is what Hanukkah is about. So it's useful to look at so that we know what they thought Hanukkah was about. And they tell their story in chapter 2 of Tractate Shabbat, in a chapter called Bameh Madlikin, what do you use to light? And what they mean is, what do you use to light Shabbat candles with? What can you use for a wick? What can you use for a candle or oil? What can it be held in? What happens if you've got something that holds oil and it's got 2 places for wicks to be? Is that 1 or 2? These are all things that they get wrapped up in the discussion about. So that's what they're talking about. And the discussion starts to rope in whether you have to use the same stuff for Hanukkah or whether you can be more lax about your Hanukkah menorah. Do you have to use the same wick, the same kinds of oil, or can you use cheaper stuff? Or stuff that maybe wouldn't otherwise be suitable, or That's the discussion they're having. So, like many things in the Talmud, we're having a very technical discussion, and then some random thing comes in. And out of nowhere, they start telling you what the rules of Hanukkah are about. The rules for Hanukkah are actually not in the Mishnah. They show up here. So in the Mishnah, they've been assuming that we knew all of this stuff. Now they're going to teach it. They say our rabbis taught in a Baraita. Baraita is by the people who wrote the Mishnah, but not in the Mishnah. Baraita is an Aramaic word that means outside. So our rabbis taught in a Baraita, the mitzvah of Hanukkah is one light for a person and his household. What do you have to do to follow the rules for Hanukkah? One candle. Light one candle for the Maccabee children. But you light one candle all 8 days. That's the basic rule. You don't light increasing numbers of candles every day. You light one candle per day, per house. Doesn't matter how many people live there. One candle per day, per house for the 8 days of Hanukkah. That's how they start telling us the rules. And you would be justified in saying, I have that thing with 9 receptacles for candles. What do you mean one candle? I could have been doing one candle this whole time and not paying for all of those weird 44 candle boxes of really very bad candles for Hanukkah, right? Because they're terrible candles. They're already broken when you open the box, right? The Manischewitz ones are awful. You want good Hanukkah candles, you'll pay $15 a box for good Hanukkah candles. So our rabbis taught in a Baraita, the mitzvah of Hanukkah is one light for a person in his household. Those who beautify things, a light for every person. So if you want to make nice with the mitzvah, everybody in the household gets to light a candle. Those who go above and beyond that. Beit Shammai says on the first day you light 8 and subtract 1 each day. And Beit Hillel says on the first day you light 1 and then you add each day another candle. So, all right, we've already got Shammai and Hillel arguing, which is like classic rabbi stuff. And we have 3 categories of people. We have regular people. We have people who beautify things. And the Hebrew here is mehadrin, which is to make something pretty or nice or glorious or something like that. And then we have the people above and beyond. They are the mehadrin, mehadrin. They're the people who make pretty even above pretty. So on the first day, mehadrin, mehadrin, lights 8, and then you subtract 1 each day. Hillel says, no, you start and you go higher. So we've already got a disagreement as to how you do the Hanukkah menorah. This doesn't even get into which direction you put the candles in and which direction you light them. You want to know that? I got a video for you up on our YouTube channel. The whole thing, which direction you put them in, which direction. So we've already got them. Here we go. We've got a dispute. We've got the version of things we recognize, because the version we recognize is you have a menorah and you light 1 on day 1, and then you light 2 on day 2, and you light 3 on day 3, right? We know how this story goes. We know what we do. The surprising part is that what we do is what the people who are really, really pious were supposed to be doing. Maybe we should go back to 1 candle. I don't know. We're not really concerned about keeping mitzvot per se, so whatever. But the way we do Hanukkah is supposed to be the exception and not the norm. At least in 500 CE. It's supposed to be the exception and not the norm. And then we get another discussion. We got to figure out why these guys think this. Right? The Talmud is all about why. The Talmud is actually not about practical answers. Half the time when the Talmud does reach a conclusion, the conclusion it reaches is not what we do. like here. So Ulla says, two Amoraim rabbis from the land of Israel disagreed concerning these issues. Yossi ben Avin and Yosef ben Tzvida. The former said, Beit Shammai's reasoning is that you go according to the end of the holiday. You do a countdown. And Beit Hillel's reasoning is that you go according to how many days have passed, right? So every day you add, and he sees no other big thing in this. Well, they just disagree and they go in a different order. That's Yossi ben Avin. Yossi ben Tzvida says the latter, that's him, says Beit Shammai thinks, well, you go according to how many days are left. And Beit Hillel says you only increase holiness, you don't decrease it. So lighting more candles means you're making each day more holy. That's Rabbi Hillel's reasoning here. And it's the one that's persuasive. We know it's the one that's persuasive because it's what we do. So it's held out for all these years. And Beit Hillel would have been 2,000 years ago. So this has been the rule for 2,000 years for people who want to light the full menorah. So we now have how we do Hanukkah sort of outlined. You'll notice there are no dreidels. I feel obliged to tell you, if you didn't know, that the dreidel is actually a drinking game brought to Germany by British sailors in the 15 or 1600s. So yes, we are teaching our children to play a betting game that was played by drunk sailors in German ports. Via con Dios is inappropriate with us, but there you go. That's why Dreidel's not in the Talmud. We had to make up a great miracle happened there. Nes Gadol Hayasham. We had to make up a thing for the letters on the dreidel, because otherwise it really is just a cue to put in half your money or whatever. So now we know why you increase the number of candles, because Hillel said, you increase, but don't decrease holiness. By the way, that's not true, but moving on. We're not going to worry too much about Rabbi Hillel being wrong here. And then our rabbis taught in a Baraita, the Hanukkah light, you're supposed to put it at the door of your house outside. If you live in an elevated apartment, you put it in a window facing a public area. In times of danger, you put it on your table, and that's good enough. Why? Why are you supposed to put it in a window or put it outside your door? The Talmud hasn't answered the question. So you're allowed to say, I don't actually know why. The Talmud hasn't told us yet. The answer is you're supposed to publicize the miracle. The miracle. But we don't know what the miracle even is yet, so they can't say that here. So you're supposed to put it outside your door. If you can't do that because you live in an apartment, you put it in the window. If it's not safe, you put it on your table and call it good. Rava said one needs another candle to use for its light, though if there's a bonfire, you don't need this. Right, so Nadine says, so neighbors can see, Pirsomet Hanes, the publicizing the miracle. Rava said one needs another candle to use for its light. You're not supposed to use your menorah for light. You're only supposed to look at it. So if you need the lights on for something, you can't use the menorah. You've got to have another candle that you're using. But if there's a bonfire, there's light outside, then you don't have to light another candle. Unless you're an important person, in which case light your own damn candle. That's what the Talmud is saying here. You're rich, light a candle. We don't want people to think that you're being skimpy and using your menorah for light. So light a candle. You're rich, you can deal with it. Poor people, we get you may have a hard time even having a candle for Hanukkah. We still don't want you to use it for light. but you can use ambient light from outside if you need to. You don't need to make us worried that you're using your Hanukkah menorah for light when you shouldn't be. But it's conveying that you need other lights besides the menorah. You're not supposed to read by the menorah or cobble shoes or whatever it is you're going to do, cook. We still don't know what Hanukkah is, but we know we have all these rules about what you do with your menorah, which is very rabbi-like, that we're going to give you all the rules, and we'll tell you why later. Here's the why. What is Hanukkah? They literally, finally, they've gone on for about a whole page now, telling us all the rules for what you can and can't do with your menorah, and what happens if you leave your menorah outside your door, and we're going to get back to that, and there's a fire. What is Hanukkah? Finally, what is Hanukkah? Our rabbis taught in a Baraita, yet another one of these outside sources, on the 25th of Kislev, the 8 days of Hanukkah begin. You don't eulogize someone, no funerals, and you don't fast on them. Since when the Greeks entered the temple, they rendered impure all the oil that was in the temple, but when the Hasmonean dynasty triumphed and overcame them, they sought and found only a single pot of oil that had the seal of the high priest upon it, and there was only enough light in it. There was only enough in it to light for a single day. We know this story. This is where this story comes from. 663 years after Hanukkah happened. That's when we finally get this story. A miracle was performed with it, and they used it to light for 8 days. Hey, look at that. The following year, they fixed those days and made them into a holiday, days of praise and thanks. And we should say, days of praise here, they mean that in synagogues, you would recite a specific additional chunk of liturgy called the Hallel, or the Hallel. We're not in the business of reciting the Hallel. Honestly, most American Jews would be surprised that you're supposed to recite the Hallel, but it's fine. But this is the Hanukkah story we recognize, right? One little thing of oil that would only last a day, but it miraculously lasted 8 days. No other source talks about this as being the Hanukkah story, just the Talmud. So Larry says, it seems the high priest's seal was needed to praise, though the temple had been destroyed. Can one now do without the priest's blessing? So the seal on the oil was actually to keep, so the seal that they're talking about is actually like a wax stamp on the top of the cruse of oil so that you knew, oh, we've checked this oil, it's kosher. Although they probably wouldn't have said kosher back then. I mean, maybe they might have used that word. So that's the story of the oil. We know that story, right? That's the Hanukkah story that everybody's told. And when we teach people the dreidel game, and we tell them Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle happened there, the miracle that children are usually taught in American Judaism is the miracle of the oil. I have 3 Hanukkah books for the kids, and each of them teaches the oil story. 8 Wild Nights, which has lots of fun pictures. Hanukkah with Nashi Boy and Friends. In case you're wondering, Nashi Boy's friends are Kvetchy Boy, Schmutzy Girl, Klutzy Boy, and Schluffy Girl. Kvetchy Boy is, well, Kvetchy. Schmutzy Girl is dirty. Klutzy Boy, well, klutzy. And Schluffy Girl is sleepy. That's what Schluffy means. So, and Nashi Boy obviously wants to eat all the latkes. That's Nashi Boy's thing. He's Nashi Boy. They each have some version of the story of the oil as what Hanukkah is about. Oh, and the Magic Menorah, which is a chapter book for kids, which also has the story of the oil in it. So that's our story. We know that story. We've been told that story before. And then we get more laws. We're back to tort law. A spark that comes out from under a hammer lights a fire, you're liable. Camel that has flax goes through public space, flax lights on fire. Owner of the camel is liable. If the storekeeper set his light outside his house and caused a fire, he's liable. But Rabbi Judah says if he put his menorah outside his door and that started a fire in public, he's exempt. Why? Because it's a mitzvah to light the Hanukkah menorah, so you can't be in trouble for lighting the Hanukkah menorah if it accidentally starts a fire in the marketplace. Everybody's just supposed to know it's Hanukkah and be careful. But we went straight into tort law after this because this is how the rabbis do things. And then it goes on to talk about, okay, you're putting the menorah outside your door. How high or low does it have to be? If it's too high, it's invalid. If it's too low, it's invalid. You're supposed to publicize the miracle, blah, 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 blah. Can you use a Shabbat candle? If you light a Shabbat light and it lasts the whole day and into the next day, can you then use that candle to light your menorah after Shabbat is over? This is a question they seriously asked, and we have an answer. We're not going to worry about all those rules because there's like a page and a half of discussion on that issue alone. So let's sum up what they said. Lots of halacha, lots of normative stuff to discuss. Ordinarily, you only need one candle per household. Anything past that is an additional level of piety. There's a dispute over how you do that, right? Hillel versus Shammai, do you add or do you subtract candles? This occurs because of the success of the Maccabean revolt and the oil in the temple. You notice how they mention that the Hasmoneans win, but actually we're going to talk about the oil a whole bunch. One requirement is showing the Hanukkah lights publicly, which gets to be named Pirsomet Hanes, which means publicizing the miracle. And farther on, we learn women are obligated to light Hanukkah menorahs too. So men and women alike, because women are part of the Hanukkah story. So there's a text called the Book of Judith that the rabbis know about the story, and Judith kills the general Holofernes, and so Judith is involved with the winning of the Hanukkah story. So women are obligated to light a menorah too if no one else in their house is doing it. And, spoiler alert, I guess, after the Hanukkah candles are lit, women are supposed to get the night off. Because of Judith. This is in the law codes. Women get the night off. So it's the one time that the rabbis are like, oh, look. Okay, so that's all the old rabbi stuff. Questions about the old rabbi stuff?
I have one question. One of the things you read referred to an elevated apartment. So I was trying to figure out when this stuff was written, if they were talking.
So elevated apartments, multi-story apartment buildings are actually common in the ancient world. They would have stairs going up. So we actually know that this was the standard layout of much of ancient Rome, that you would have these pretty cheaply built apartment buildings, and they'd be 3 or 4 stories high. And the first floor would be shops, and then above that would be apartments. So apartment buildings are actually normal in the ancient world because you want to live in a city and land is expensive, so that's how you live there.
Okay, thank you.
And we know massive fires in Rome killed thousands of people at a go in these apartment buildings because, again, they were not well built. Rick?
If the rabbis say that a miracle occurred, why is Hanukkah a minor holiday? What's the importance of miracles in their relationship to holiday?
Okay, so if the rabbis say a miracle happened, why is Hanukkah a minor holiday? Remember how I said that Hanukkah is in the Tanakh? Yeah, the rabbis don't think so. They actually don't think that Hanukkah is in the Tanakh. They don't view the book of Daniel as telling anything about the Hanukkah story. They view the book of Daniel as being about the end of the world. World hasn't ended yet. Can't be about Hanukkah. And the rabbis recognize that pretty much all of the practices associated with Hanukkah are things they made up, or that people made up but have no footing in the Bible anywhere other than the book of Daniel, but they don't recognize that. So they view it as a minor holiday. It's not a Shabbat. You do some stuff, it still interrupts some of the things you might do, like fasting if there's a drought, or you're not going to eulogize somebody if they die. But otherwise, it's not a big holiday. Note as well, neither is Purim. So you read the Megillah on Purim, but nobody gets off of work for Purim. Again, the rabbis know that all of the stuff about Purim, there's no commandment for Purim anywhere in the Torah or anywhere in the Bible, so it's a minor holiday. Like, it automatically is a minor holiday to them because there's just no commandment for it. Now, the traditional blessing for lighting the Hanukkah candle is different from the traditional blessing for lighting Shabbat candles by one word. So it is, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who commanded us to light the Hanukkah candle." There's no commandment. There is, by the way, no commandment to light Shabbat candles either. Nobody lit Shabbat candles in the Torah. You tossed a few more sacrifices on the altar. That's what you did in the Torah. So the idea of commandment, not really there, but they do recognize they made some of this stuff up. Joyce.
Yes, one other question. When you talked about not using your menorah as a light candle or whatever, it just made me think about I'm going to butcher this, the shamash, the helper candle. Is that in there anywhere?
Yeah, so they do talk about what do you use to light the candles themselves. So they imagine that you'd be lighting cruces of oil, and they do get wrapped up in what you can use. Do you have to light a separate thing that you then use to light the other? So they do actually go down the road of talking about the shamash, that helper light. And eventually, the development of the shamash is a thing that reflects increasing affluence and the move to using candles from little pots of oil. Because you don't try to light a little pot of oil with another little pot of oil, because as you can imagine, you go like this and there's oil everywhere, and now you have a big fire. As candles became more common, they said, yeah, you have to light the candle and then use the candle to light the other things as like an intermediate step. Because they are worried about you trying to use a Shabbat candle, a Shabbat light that had lasted more than 25 hours. They don't want you to use that to light a menorah either. That's a part we didn't discuss because that's like a page and a half of discussion about, a page and a half in Aramaic, which is like 8 pages in English. So
thank you.
How much time do we really want to spend on that?
Right. Thank you.
I recognize that I'm the only person who's likely to be super interested in that sort of thing. And honestly, most rabbis are not interested in that sort of thing either. Okay, so we got our miracle of the oil. We got our menorah practice maybe, but we have this one candle thing, right? So we're going to have to figure out what happens over time that we end up doing what we do. And what happens over time is like with many things related to Jewish law, there is a drive to be more stringent. And in the drive to be more stringent, you get a move toward doing a menorah with multiple candles. I mean, that's the real long-term story here. So Hanukkah gets a lot more ink spilled in medieval and modern sources. By the Middle Ages, unknown Jews had written, among other things, Megillat Antiochus, the scroll of Antiochus in Aramaic, got translated to Hebrew, which is based on First Maccabees, on some other sources, and we'll look at it next week. That basic story gets pulled into Halakha so that the story expands a little bit from the cruse of oil. Oh, also they won a war, right? Because that's how the rabbis presented it, was, oh, they won a war. Big story about cruse of oil. And the texts firm up practice to look more like what we do today. And they start to assume that what we do today is what you do, as opposed to one candle per person. So 1180 CE, the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides, says, during the time of the Second Temple, when Greece reigned, they made decrees against Israel and negated their religion and did not leave them alone to occupy themselves with Torah and the commandments. They stretched out their hands toward their wealth and their daughters, and they entered the temple, and they laid waste inside it, and they made impure the pure things, and they troubled Israel greatly because of these things. And they imposed a great persecution upon them until the God of our fathers had mercy upon them and saved them from their hand. And the sons of the Hasmonean, the high priests, also saved people, is their point. And they killed them and saved Israel from their hand. And they appointed a king from among the priests, and kingship returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the second destruction of the temple. Okay. Big story about a war now. Right, so this is part of Maimonides' code of Jewish law. So when you go to read about Hanukkah to figure out what you're supposed to do from Maimonides, there's the story of the war, which the rabbis kind of went, there was a war. Oil, look at the oil. Yeah, there was a war. Because the rabbis were in the business of de-emphasizing war because we had lost a few by then, and they really didn't want Jews being, getting in trouble as rebels. It hadn't turned out well. They weren't going to talk about it. And then, when Israel was victorious on the 25th day of Kislev, they entered the temple and found one cruse of oil. Good enough for a day only, but it worked for 8 days. And then Maimonides spends the rest of this chapter talking about the Hallel prayer that I mentioned earlier, and what sections of it you keep and what you skip and what you add in and all sorts of other things. But we finally have the rest of the story. And the rest of the story is this. Dramatized, but this. We are now 1,300 some years after the Hanukkah story before Jewish law officially adopts the story. I mentioned the scroll of Antiochus, Megillat Antiochus, this thing here. Megillat Antiochus was actually read in Italian synagogues as though it were the Megillah for Hanukkah, just like the book of Esther is read as the Megillah for Purim. This was not a universal practice, but Italian synagogues did this. How many candles do we, here we are. How many candles do you light for Hanukkah? The commandment is there should be a single candle for each and every house, however many people there are. And those who beautify the commandment, the Mehadrin, one lights candles for as many people as in the house, one for each person, whether they are men or women. Those who do even more, one lights a candle for each and every person on the first night and adds to that each and every night. Now, Maimonides might not be right here. If we go back and look at the Talmud for just a second, where do we go? See, I've lost our thing with Hillel. Oh, here it is. Beit Shammai says on the first day you light 8 and subtract 1. Beit Hillel says on the first day you light 1 and then add from there. Do they say everyone in the house does that? Maimonides says everyone in the house has their own menorah and does this. It's not really in here. Maimonides made up a rule because he assumed, okay, well, the people who really beautify things, everybody does it. So if you're really going to beautify things, why would you then not light everybody each having their own menorah? Maimonides says, if you really want to do it upright, everybody lights their own menorah and adds each night. And he says, how do you do this? Suppose there are 10 people in the house. On the first night, one lights 10 candles. Second night, 20. Third night, 30. Onward until you get 80 on the 8th night. This is not what's in the Talmud. The Talmud actually isn't clear. So Maimonides is making a call on what you're supposed to do. And basically he says, if you're going to do a menorah, everybody's got to do a menorah. Except the usual custom, and he's using the word minhag. Minhag is not like when in Rome, do what the Romans do. Minhag is custom that's so established that it might as well be Jewish law in many places. The usual custom throughout all our cities in Sepharad is that the people in the house light one candle the first night and add another candle until there are 8 candles on the 8th night, no matter how many people are in the house. This is what we recognize as Hanukkah the way many families do it. You might buy other family members menorahs. You may have multiple menorahs. We have very many menorahs here. We lived in an area of Indianapolis where people retired and moved to Florida and left behind their menorahs at the Goodwill. So we got a lot of menorahs from Goodwill. But Maimonides says the thing that we do in Sepharad, which Sepharad literally means Spain, but he's writing in Egypt. So he's clearly exercising authority over, like, the entire Middle East. Throughout our cities in Sepharad, the family has one menorah, and you go from 1 to 8 candles for the whole family. Not one candle, not one per person, not a whole menorah per person, but just one menorah for the whole family. So we recognize this as a thing that we do now. This is when it really becomes codified Jewish law that this is what you're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to do. Okay, so that was Maimonides. We're in the 12th century. Now we're in the 16th century. How many lights do you light on the first night? You light 1, and then you add until there are 8. And even if there are many people in the house, you don't have to do more than that. Hagahot Harema. So this Jewish law code is for Sephardic Jews. The Rema is a German commentator who gussies it up for Ashkenazic Jews. There are some who say that each and every member of the household should light, Maimonides, and that's the usual custom. So he's actually misread Maimonides. And they should be careful to put each person's candles in a different place so you can tell how many lights you're lighting. So if you have 10 people living in the house and they're each lighting their own menorah, you have to find 10 different spots in the house for lighting the menorahs, and somehow they're all supposed to be visible. I guess you line them up outside the door, except that actually you're only supposed to have so much space between the door and your menorah. So yet another law to worry about. But this is, here we go. You only light one menorah. You don't have to do a whole bunch, but some people say you should. Okay. Candles aren't cheap. oil and wicks aren't cheap if you are poor, which most Jews were. So if you can't afford all these candles and all this oil, what do you do? And the answer is, we got an answer in the 1880s. So Mishnah Berurah is kind of like a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, a particularly stringent one. We'll go with that. It's a particularly stringent one. And it says, well, okay, so you only, from the first night you light one, and then you go and increase. He says, if you can only afford one candle for each night, one candle's enough. So we think, oh, you have to do a menorah, but he's saying, well, not actually. Actually, really, the commandment is still just the one candle per household. And the Shulchan Aruch saying about a whole menorah, that only pertains if you can afford to be that way. Like we talked about in the Talmud, is what he's saying. One candle for each night, adding on. And if you have 9 candles, let's say you're wealthy enough that you have more than 8 candles to spare, but you don't have enough to have 44 candles. Well, 44 minus 8, right? So 32. 32? No, 36. Because the other 8 are the shamash candles in the box of Hanukkah candles. Technically, you maybe don't need those. So if you only have enough oil or enough candles, what do? And they say, okay, so the first night you light 1, and the second night you light 2, and then all the other nights you only need to light 1. But what if you have 10 candles? Well, if you have 10 candles, because that's not really enough to get you increases on nights 2 and 3. If you have 10 candles, you light 2 the second night, and then you only light 1 the rest of them, and hang on to your candle, is their answer. If you had 11 candles, then you could do 1 on the first night, 2 on the second night, 3 on the third night, and then 1 for all the other nights, right? So they've got a contingency plan for if you've got enough for extra candles, but not too many candles, right? Until the last night. Somebody who doesn't have a lot of oil left, you did all the extra lighting and it turns out you miscalculated your oil supply or your candle supply. You don't have enough oil left to do all 8 fully on the last night of Hanukkah. So one of the slots on your menorah should have enough oil to light for the required amount of time, which is about a half an hour. And then you divide up the remainder among the rest. They burn however long they burn. Because if you divided out the oil equally, you don't have enough to light even 1, so you should consolidate them. But if you know that you've got this problem, you should do something different. If your neighbor doesn't have enough, give them your oil. It's okay if you only light 1 per night. Your neighbor doesn't have enough to light, so you should give your neighbor your extra candles or your oil if your neighbor doesn't have. So there's a piece we didn't talk about, which is that if somebody is poor and doesn't have money for candles or oil or wicks or whatever it is, they're actually supposed to go ask the rich people in town. And the rich people are supposed to give them enough oil or candle for Hanukkah. The same rule applies for 4 cups of wine on Passover. By the way, poor people are supposed to go hit up the rich people, and the rich people are supposed to give them some wine. So they really want you to light at least 1 candle, because that's the rule. And so if you've got extra, not so much that you can actually do all 8 nights, but some extra, give to your neighbor so that your neighbor can light candles themselves. Because your neighbor's supposed to be hitting up people for candles if they don't have them and they can't afford them. This reflects much more scarcity in these kinds of resources than we're accustomed to thinking about. Because let's face it, so you go to Target and you buy a decent box of Hanukkah candles, or maybe you buy the lousy box of Hanukkah candles or whatever. It's a few dollars. This was clearly not a few dollars, even in the 1880s. This wasn't a few dollars to people. So people really did sacrifice to be able to do what we take for granted in 8 days of Hanukkah, that you add each night. Because they didn't have electricity, they had heating oil. The ideal oil is olive oil, because that's supposedly what the high priest used. Olive oil is not exactly an easy thing to get when you live in Eastern Europe where there aren't olive trees. So they really are thinking about how much it costs to be that person who goes above and beyond, whereas for us, mostly it's pretty affordable to go above and beyond. You can go to Target right now and pick up a menorah for $10. You have your choice of styles, in fact, as well as mugs that say oy vey and all kinds of other things. And, there's that rack all on its own in the middle of the aisle in Target that has all this stuff. Or Bed Bath & Beyond. Bed Bath & Beyond always has a bunch of Hanukkah stuff too. But they really were thinking about how expensive it is. And we're trying to make it clear you don't have to do the big thing. And then I mentioned that women get the night off, according to the rabbis, on Hanukkah after the candles are lit, because Judith killed this important general, and that helped win Hanukkah, so women are supposed to get the night off. Ami had to log off early, but I do know that Ami makes pretty good latkes, so maybe Anne does get the night off on Hanukkah. But women are considered to have a special role on Hanukkah, and we know about fried food on Hanukkah. People also eat blintzes. Blintzes have cheese in them. Judith fed the general cheese, which made him thirsty. Then she got him drunk. Then she cut off his head. So the blintzes with the cheese is also a link into Hanukkah. Okay, so I know we're close to 9 o'clock, but folks have questions. I'm happy to answer questions and dispense with the big slides. And Larry mentions there's lots of ways to do it. Some are severable. I don't even have an active law license anymore, and yet somehow these words keep coming up in my life.
Jeremy, you were talking about why there was no mention of Hanukkah for centuries, I guess.
Yeah.
About that it was actually an act of rebellion, and it was not healthy for Jews in a subservient position to talk about a successful rebellion. I always thought, though, that the rabbis were didn't like the Hasmoneans for other reasons, that they usurped the high priest position, and maybe we'll talk about that next week. But that they violated, while you're supposed to see them as the bearers of the tradition, what we would call the Orthodox tradition, or whatever, the law, they actually violated the law in very drastic ways. And that's why the rabbis didn't like them. That's what I always thought was why they tried to eliminate Hanukkah, in effect. They tried to not talk about it.
Yeah, there's a combination of things happening with why they wouldn't mention it. They seem to recognize that they can't avoid it totally. I mean, they do actually mention the Hasmoneans in the Talmud in this, but it is dismissive.
So
Uh,
the idea was that it's like kol nidre. You can't get rid of it because the people love it.
yeah. They don't like the Hasmoneans, although there are one or two that they do like. Ironically, one of the ones that they like happens to be the only woman who was in charge as a Hasmonean, because she liked the Pharisees and she let them in, and they were really the Pharisees. But yeah, they don't like the Hasmoneans at all. By the time you get to the Babylonian Talmud, some of that is starting to be less intense. So a lot of the don't like the Hasmoneans, right? They still have all the negative stories, but the real antipathy is in the stuff that happens between the Mishnah and the Talmud. That's where these Midrasha collections that we talked about during the summer, that's where you get a lot of the really obvious antipathy, that by the time that some of those stories get repeated in the Talmud, they've softened a little bit. Not a lot, but they are different by the time you get there.
I have a question about the responsibility of the rich to take care of the poor during Hanukkah for their ritual observances. And I was wondering, to what extent does the religious text presume that there's a certain amount of income and wealth inequality within the Jewish community, and that the richer Jews are responsible for the poorer ones, and I assume then for the synagogues as well?
Yes, there is an assumption that there will be rich people and poor people. And they actually derive it in part from the Torah. So Deuteronomy says, you shall have no poor people. And then it talks about poor people a lot. So they assume that there are going to be people who are poor and people who are rich, and that there should be some amount of subsidization, particularly for religious activities. And they assume that even in the Talmud, it's assumed. Because when they're talking about Passover and they're talking about the 4 cups of wine, they actually start talking about that in the Talmud, that you should be going to rich people and getting your wine, and they have to provide it. So it's just there as an assumption. Just like, the corners of the field, right? The whole, okay, so you don't cultivate the corners of your field and you let people go through. That's its own tractate in the Talmud. It's not worked out in the Babylonian Talmud as much, but the Palestinian Talmud has a full thing on it. That is just an assumption. So whether it's cups of wine or it's enough oil and wick to be able to get through Hanukkah, the assumption is there will be some subsidization and that there's going to be income inequality.
A follow-up question on that.
Mhm.
Were the rich supposed to do the full amount of candles and then just give the leftover oil, or were they supposed to do lesser, like one, instead of gradually doing more per night? So that there's a bit of a difference in approach there.
So the assumption is, the assumption the rabbis work with is that you will, if you have the means, do more. So there's a concept called Hadrat HaMitzvah, the idea that you gussy up, you pretty up the commandment, whatever it is. So you spend as much as you can afford to spend. For a rich person, you can afford to spend a lot. And the assumption is you probably should. And they're okay with that, because the idea is, well, that means that you are investing in following the commandments. And you'll note, so the language that they use is mehadrin, people who make it pretty, and mehadrin meha-mehadrim, the people who do it really, really, really pretty. They don't say chasidim, righteous. They say pretty.
Mm.
So there are people who do it, there are people who make it look pretty, and people who make it look really pretty. Not people who are pious, people who are more pious, and people who are really pious. If they meant that, they could have said it, but what they said is people who do it pretty. So the implication is rich people can afford to do it pretty and should.
So rich people can afford to do it pretty and should, and then give the leftover.
Well, they're supposed to give the leftover up front, because the idea is they should be helping people observe Hanukkah to make sure that they have the oil and the wicks and whatever else in advance.
Okay, but you're not asking rich people to do less. You're
No.
just asking them to make sure their neighbor can do something.
Right.
I think
Okay.
the assumption is the rich people are really rich.
Yeah.
The idea of the middle class is a very modern idea. It doesn't come into this picture. That's what you're talking about. People who maybe had a little bit more, and I think that's not what existed in any society. You had really rich people, and the 98% who had almost nothing from our perspective.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's a wide gap, such that even people who in our minds are middle class people, rabbis are middle class people mostly, in modern times, maybe a little bit above sometimes, maybe a little bit below other times, but they're supposed to be somewhere in the middle class. Rabbis are poor if they're not independently wealthy, all the way up until, I mean, now in the Orthodox world, many rabbis are poor. But definitely in the 1880s and the 1500s, right, these rabbis who are running yeshivas, they have to go begging for money, and nobody lives particularly well. So, and that's the middle class, is also going and asking for money. So, people educated with expertise also don't have cash.
Okay.
And the Talmud makes it very clear that even really skilled workers like blacksmiths are poor. So there's a story where there's a rabbi who's a blacksmith, and he is walking with another rabbi who is really, really rich. And the rich rabbi has never bothered to really look closely at this poor rabbi. And then they walk by the poor rabbi's house, and the walls are black because he's a blacksmith. He doesn't have money to paint. The smithy is right there. The furnace spews onto the side of his house, and he kind of has this moment where he goes, I didn't realize you were so poor.
So it's not they're not commanding redistribution, they're commanding charity.
Yes. Yeah, they're not commanding income redistribution. And this discussion about living wage and minimum wage and what should the minimum wage be. So the conservative movement has a responsum written by Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is from Trua. She's a conservative rabbi, and she wrote their text on minimum wage and labor rights and all kinds of other things. And she says, in essence, there should be a minimum wage. It should be a living wage. And Jewish organizations should pay that. And also Jewish law requires it. And then there's an Orthodox piece in one of Yeshiva University's academic publications that goes into much more detail about Jewish law and says, no, There's no obligation to pay a living wage. And quite frankly, on just bare Jewish law terms, the Yeshiva University paper is right.
That's the no obligation argument.
Yep.
Okay. I don't want to prolong that, but one last thing. I was reading about what's going on in with the landlords in Brooklyn, the super Orthodox landlords and the various Hasidic tenants being unable to pay their rents.
Mhm.
And I would say that they don't, their actions don't seem to suggest any obligation.
The real difficulty with the Hasidic landlords is that they're following Jewish law, right? They're following Halacha.
Okay.
They don't feel bound by New York law. And with their Hasidic tenants in particular, they feel like those disputes should not be going outside of our community, just like they feel that way about sexual abuse allegations. So
Yes.
it's all of a piece of,
Mhm.
yes, there is a Jewish law concept that you follow the law of the land, but actually we're not going to if we think a private arrangement can be reached.
Mhm.
This is why there's such difficulty with custody issues. Halacha has its own rules for custody and for child support, and they don't match New York state law. But New York state law says there's a bare minimum that you have to pay, and so there is a conflict between these two bodies of law. And when it's contract law and landlord-tenant law, they think there should be more leeway.
Interesting. Thank you.
So it does become an issue for Hasidic tenants in particular, because the expectation is you're going to not bring this to the New York Superior Court. You're going to keep this between us, right? Because you're a Yid and I'm a Yid, we're Yidden together. And so this is what we do.
Yeah. Hence the intense negotiation with politicians.
On everything.
Yeah.
On custody, on whatever. Yeah. It touches lots of different pieces of law that maybe ordinarily you wouldn't think of.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You don't have to be Hasidic. The Kushner Corporation, of course, is about to evict all of its non-paying tenants. So
Yeah.
Which corporation?
Kushner.
Jared Kushner's,
What?
well, the subsidies have expired, and so people can't pay anymore.
Wow.
I'll tell a story we're talking about. I remember many years ago, there was a proposal in Montgomery County to have a living wage, and the Jewish organizations all rose up in arms against it because they couldn't pay their orderlies. They do wonderful things. I mean, I'm not, but they have institutions that care for people, and the employees who care for people make very little money, and they just didn't have enough. And I remember I was at the meeting, and I don't know if anybody remembers, Rick may remember Abe Poland. And
Yes.
Abe Poland owned the Washington Capitals. He was a very wealthy real estate developer. And he stood up and he was in tears that they would do this, that they would go against this that these Jewish organizations would speak out against a living wage. And finally he said, I will get enough people like me who are wealthy enough to pay this. If, I don't know how it turned out, but I'll never forget that day. He was a wonderful guy. I don't know how many, again, you probably don't remember him unless you've lived here a long time.
I do remember
He was
hearing
one of the
him.
great people of this area, Poland. But I'll never forget that day. It just he happened to be on the subject where he just stood up
Wow.
and said, I thought this was a Jewish, what happened to Jewish things. And of course, what you're saying, Jeremy, is that they were going by the Jew, right? They were just doing their thing. But these were the liberal Jews. I mean, these were not the Hasidim. These were the nice, wonderful Jews who we agree with on everything except Israel, right? We're just trying to do, well, I mean, it's the truth. These are wonderful, wonderful people who are running these social service organizations and said, we can't afford to raise these people's salaries. We don't have the money.
Yep.
So, anyway, got me going on that.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
Great. Thanks so much.
All
Thank
right.
you so much. Very